Welcome to the Platform Podcast, where we talk to coaches, athletes, experts, and real people to learn about their approaches to training, nutrition, mindset, and much more. I'm your host, Jordan Kundy Wright, founder and head coach of the Twin Cities Kettlebell Club, and our mission is to become our best selves through sport. A friendly reminder, registration is open for the WKSF North American Championship. The fourth annual kettlebell competition in the Twin Cities will be hosted on Saturday, September 28th by our friends at the Athlete Lab in Little Canada, Minnesota. And just like I did last year, we will include video submission options for participants who can't make the trip in person. And you're going to be eligible for all of the same prizes as our in-person competitors. Just go to our website, twincitieskettlebellclub.com for details. Now, this episode is a replay of a free nutrition seminar I did called Eat Like an Athlete, Fueling High Performance, that I facilitated earlier this year for Kim Fox's Kettlebell Sport Almanac Facebook group. If you're not a member, it's a great place to go for free resources for anyone who loves kettlebell sports. So go check it out and join the group if you have a chance. Now, this is also going to be released on the Platform Podcast YouTube channel. If you're not subscribed there, do so. Go follow the Twin Cities Kettlebell Club on YouTube. Click the like, subscribe, and the little bell to get notified anytime a new video is released. And of course, last but not least, if you want help reaching your goals without wasting time, please fill out the coaching interest form linked in the show notes. I help athletes of all levels with my integrated coaching approach. You can follow me on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at Twin Cities Kettlebell Club, or email me at twincitieskettlebellclub@gmail.com. Now, let's step onto the platform to discuss eating like an athlete, fueling high performance. Today's topic was how to eat like an athlete, fueling for performance. Because one of the things that I run into a lot is I see athletes tend to not act in the way that you would expect an athlete to act. They act as though they are just normal, regular people, and they follow the regular nutrition advice that's out there for people who are just living their day-to-day life. And so we're going to get into how some of those things differ and why that is. So I have to start with the legal disclaimer to cover everyone's butts, right? That I am not a doctor. This is not medical advice. Make sure you talk to a doctor. Kim's not a doctor. She's not giving medical advice, right? And anything that we present is for educational, informational purposes. Blah 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 blah. So just take everything I say with the grain of salt that you should confirm with your doctor before you implement any strategy or make any changes based on that. So, now that we have sufficiently covered our butts, I will give you a little bit about my story. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Jordan Kundy Wright. I'm the founder and head coach of the Twin Cities Kettlebell Club. And the reason I care so much about nutrition in general is I was a fat kid. I got teased a lot as a younger kid for being 4 feet wide and 4 feet tall. At one point I was about as wide as I was tall. I was always a kind of a chubby kid, but I was always an athlete. And I actually became a college athlete. I focused on actually getting big and strong in high school. I just decided if I was going to be big, I was going to be really big. So I became a college offensive lineman. Did track and field, did rugby, and at one point I was fairly fit. And then after college football was done, I kept eating like I was still playing college football and trying to be 280 pounds. And I very quickly became over 350 pounds. I capped out probably somewhere around 370, but I never actually weighed myself at my heaviest because I was ashamed of how fat I was. And so at one point I was about 370 pounds, which is somewhere in this picture here with the multiple chins. And you can't really see how big my belly is, but at one point I was so fat that my mom pulled me aside and said that she was worried for my health because I was smoking half a pack of cigarettes a day and drinking like a fish and was really overweight, etc. And that was kind of a wake-up call. But when I decided I wanted to get married, I didn't want to look like this in my wedding pictures. So I started learning about personal training, and I got my personal training certification back in 2008. And then I got a kettlebell certification in 2009. And then I got a kettlebell sport certification in 2010. And then I went down the nutrition rabbit hole as well. And, the too long didn't read version, I lost over 100 pounds, like 90 of which I lost before my wedding. And then I lost another 20 or 30 over the course of a year, got down to as low as 215 pounds. I now walk around, between 260 and 270 most of the time. I could probably be lighter than that, but for reasons we'll get into, it's maybe not the best for me. But that's kind of the long reason or the long story of why I care about nutrition so much. So, credentials. I know people don't necessarily care that much about these things, but I have a bachelor's degree. I have multiple nutrition certifications. I have multiple strength and conditioning certifications. I have multiple kettlebell certifications. Blah 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 blah. I am a huge nerd. I host the Platform podcast. If you guys aren't familiar with that, it is a kettlebell sport based podcast, and I am 6 feet tall, Hugo. I'm 6 foot nothing. So
And yeah, you should definitely check out the platform Kettlebell podcast. I mean, I've been on it, but I mean, like it is a very good podcast, and Jordan does a really good job at making it interesting. So
thank you, I appreciate that. And
you're
having
welcome.
having great guests like Kim always makes it super fun. Her interview is still one of my favorites. We had a blast and laughed a lot, and I think we missed some of the best moments were off air, but that's okay. So some of those were probably not appropriate for the larger audience. But I'm also by day an AI/ML program manager and a consultant in the data science world. So if you wonder why I'm so like data driven and so nerdy, that is why. And yeah, that is that. So now let's talk about performance, because that's kind of what we're here to talk about today. But I'm gonna start with a story. I promised you stories, so I'm gonna start with a story, and let me know if this sounds familiar. There was an American underdog who everyone counted out and thought there was no chance that this person could ever defeat a Russian monster. He was going up against, in a combat sport, somebody that was considered to be indestructible and was probably going to destroy him in such a bad way that people were going to be embarrassed for how bad this performance was going to go. If
I
it
don't think anybody will be able to guess this.
if it sounds familiar and you're like, this is Rocky Four, this is the plot of Rocky Four, we can now be friends. But that's not who I'm talking about. This is actually a real world example of the point that I'm trying to make here, which is this is Alexander Karelin. And if you're not familiar with who Alexander Karelin is, he is one of the greatest Greco-Roman wrestlers of all time. And as you can see, for obvious reasons, he was called the Russian Bear, because he would just manhandle people and he destroyed people on the mat. And he was going against this guy, Rulon Gardner, who was on The Biggest Loser at one point after his Olympic career was over. But this is what he looked like when he went into the gold medal match against Alexander Karelin, who was a multiple Olympic medalist and had been dominating Greco-Roman wrestling for a long time. And he came in, and what Rulon Gardner did was suffocate him with pressure and buried him. And people could not believe that this fat guy beat this guy who looked like a Greek god, right? If you just picked, based on appearance, who was going to win a wrestling match between these two guys, I bet most people would have bet a significant sum of money on the guy on the left, right? So what's the point I'm making here? Aesthetics do not equal performance. So for the sake of this talk, we are talking about performance. And it is very, very crucial that everyone understands that the way someone looks and the way they perform are different goals, right? So it's really important that we think about that. So what is performance? Performance is the process of carrying out an action, task, or function. So what that means is the way you're going to look is going to depend on the task at hand. So think about a marathon runner. The best marathon runners in the world are very, very thin. Like, you wouldn't necessarily look at them and be like, oh, that person is the top performing athlete, right? Or if you look at someone who is an Olympic shot putter, they're going to look very different than somebody who's an Olympic sprinter. You can look within the sport of kettlebell sport, right? You have people across different weight classes that look very different, right? And that is the reason that we don't want to conflate aesthetics with performance, because what's going to make you look your best or look the way that you might want to look is not necessarily going to be what's ideal for your performance. Now, that's not to say that Alexander Carolyn was not a top level athlete, but what his optimal performance appearance was, his aesthetics just happened to line up with that shredded appearance, and he obviously was still a top performer. But Rulon Gardner was also a top performer who actually beat him, and he looked like he looked, right? So it is really, really important that everyone understands that how you're going to look is not always going to correlate with your top performance. So we have to understand what I like to call the triangle of awareness, which is when we're talking about performance, that is at one peak of the triangle. When we're talking about aesthetics, that's another peak of the triangle. And when we're talking about health or longevity, that's another piece, right? Intensity comes at a cost. And to look your best, you're probably going to need to be at a caloric deficit, low body fat, except for what most people consider their best, right? So if you're thinking about going and winning Mr. Olympia, or some type of bodybuilding challenge, your aesthetics would be what you're trying to optimize for. Well, that's not going to necessarily correlate to high level athletic performance, and it's certainly not going to correlate to health. You can talk to any bodybuilder, and if they have been on stage walking around at 5% body fat for men, or the low teens for women, a lot of times they feel like shit. They have no energy, they have no sex drive, they're cranky. They're If you checked their blood work, it would probably be terrible, et cetera, et cetera, right? So it is very important to understand that these three goals, while not necessarily antithetical to each other, cannot be pursued simultaneously. So what I like to say is you can't chase multiple rabbits at the same time, right? If you want to optimize for performance, then you need to understand that that might not be the best option for your long-term health, or it might not be the best option for your aesthetics. Now, you don't have to index all the way to the peak of the triangle. It can be, right, oh, I want my aesthetics to be good and I want my performance to also be good, so we're somewhere in this neighborhood. Or somebody might say, well, I want to perform well, but not at the sake of sacrificing my long-term health, right? I'm not going to take PEDs and EPO and trenbolone and all of those things, right? So because that would sacrifice my health too much. So you might be somewhere in this area, but it's just important to understand that when you're thinking about how do we set up the frameworks for our nutrition, that you need to understand, are we trying to optimize performance? Are we trying to optimize our body composition or our aesthetics? Or are we trying to optimize for health and longevity? Does that make sense from just a basic at the
So
high?
I think it's a great point to make because, especially for people who work with clients or even just for yourself, I had a student that went on vacation and she came back and she was like, oh my gosh, she's like, I was on vacation and there was a lady, and she's in her 50s. And she's like, there was a lady there my age and she was ripped. And I'm like, okay, well, yeah, but that particular person, like, not that she's not strong, I'm sure this lady is strong, but I was like, you have to think about what you've been doing, and what she does, right? So there's going to be variances in what each of you can do. And just because she is ripped does not mean that she is super strong. It just means that she probably is very strict on her diet and she's in a bodybuilding workout and that's what she does like every day. So I'm like, you could do that, but you have to completely change like how you've been training and understand that just because you don't look like her doesn't mean that you're not healthy and doesn't mean that you're not strong.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, like Lasha is a great example. If you're not, I can't even remember his last name, but Lasha is the world's best Olympic weightlifter, and he holds all of the world's weightlifting records. The guy can snatch what, like 270 kilos over his head, right? But he also has a huge belly and is a super heavyweight. So if you saw him on the street, you would be like, wow, that guy is massive, but you wouldn't necessarily think, oh my God, the strongest human that's ever walked the earth. But he is one of the most explosive and powerful humans that's ever existed. So again, just another example of this whole point of performance does not always correlate to aesthetics, right? And it's just important that we understand, and it's okay to have different different phases where you pursue different things as the highest priority. So that's a part that we'll get to towards the end about periodization. But I wanted to lead with this because it's a really important piece to get into when we think about performance. Because the whole point of this talk is how do we fuel ourselves to perform? Okay, so when we think about what I call the trinity of performance, it's this intersection across the Venn diagram, right? You need to have your nutrition aligned, and that's when we're talking about energy balance, macros, micros, timing, supplementation, right? And then we talk about our training, we're talking about frequency, volume, intensity, duration, and specificity, right? And when we talk about recovery, rest, sleep, stress management, hydration, right? These things all need to be in balance as much as possible. And again, this is going to change and undulate at various times. I am a huge advocate of seasonality and periodization. So it's really important that you understand that intensity comes with a cost, and we cannot perform our best in a deficit. If there is one take-home lesson from this, I want everyone to take home that you cannot perform your best in a calorie deficit. You cannot perform your best when your body is stressed. Okay. And being in a calorie deficit is stressful on your body. So if you are trying to optimize your performance, you need to not be in a deficit. That doesn't mean you have to be in a surplus. I would argue, from a fairly well documented perspective, that being in a slight surplus is actually probably optimal for performance, but even just maintenance is going to be better. But what I can certainly unequivocally say is that operating from a deficit, operating from a deficit is not the ideal place for performance. So that would be the one thing I would definitely highlight here is you cannot perform your best if you're trying to also lose weight or trying to lose body fat. So do not chase both of those rabbits at the same time. You have to be willing to sacrifice one. And I agree, Hugo. Valery Fedorenko is another great example from our sport of somebody that you would, if you met him on the street, you would not necessarily think strongest, super strong world record holder. If you shook his hand, you might be like, oh wow, because he has meat hooks and he has a crusher of a handshake. But that's neither here nor there. All right. So performance requires fuel, quantity, type, quality, hydration, timing, supplementation. And if you thought that was in a particular order, that's because it is. That is the hierarchy that I would put it in, right? So the right number of calories, the right type of macros and micros, right? The right quality, getting your hydration right, then timing and supplementation are kind of the peak of the pyramid, right? If you don't have these things right, especially these first four, if you don't have these first four right, timing and supplementation is a waste of your time. So start with the biggest parts of the pyramid first, and then work your way up. We'll get into the details there. And again, data is your friend because I'm a data nerd, but it's objective, it's measurable, it makes the invisible visible. It can enhance your adherence, and it can enhance your motivation. Now, with that said, I am also somebody that has a history of eating disorder, and I understand that sometimes it can go too far. Tracking can be obsessive. Tracking can be stressful, right? So another take-home message for you is make it work for you. There is no one size fits all approach. It depends. And it is one of those things that you need to understand your own background and understand what works best for you, but you also need to be willing to try new things. So there is no one right answer. But for me, people that are trying to perform at their highest level, I think getting data, validating your approaches, and getting data to create a feedback loop so you know what is and is not working. Is it working in the direction that you want? Is really important. And Kim can attest to this. She has her master spreadsheet of every workout she's ever done for Kettlebell Sport for how long, Kim?
10 years.
Yeah. So that am I beating the log? Am I consistently getting better? Because without that, could you what was your PR in jerk 9.5 years ago?
I'd have to go look.
Exactly. Exactly my point.
Uh,
Right.
well, I
So
wasn't doing jerk then, but to attest to what you're talking about, there was some years ago that we're talking about performance and trying to be at a certain weight. It is possible to lose weight while you are trying to maintain performance, but I think you have to keep in mind, like most people want to lose weight pretty quickly. And when I had to cut down to like 149 pounds, like 68 kilograms for worlds, because we only could have, so many people in the professional weight class, and the other girl that was going to be in that class, um, she was much taller than me, and there was no way she was going to make that weight, 100, like 147 or whatever. And I had to do that over like a 7-month period. And I got a dietitian, and we like very closely tracked how much protein I was eating at every meal, how much, how many carbohydrates, how much fat. And then they tailored it down so that way I would have as minimal as possible impact on my performance to lose it over that time period, to make the weight. Um, and so, I mean, and it sucked because you had to track everything, and, every calorie counted to make sure I would cut weight while staying capable of lifting.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's a great call. Like, I don't want anything to come across as binary, right? It's not to say that if you're cutting, you can't perform. But what I'm saying is you can't perform optimally while cutting, right? How hard were your workouts? How did they feel, right? They probably felt harder than they normally do. They're more stressful on your body. The same level of intensity has a bigger impact on your ability to recover from it. The longer you're in that hole, the harder it gets, to lose weight, the more your performance suffers, et cetera, right? So it's not that these things are binary, but think of it on the continuum of like, I'm going to toggle down my calories. My performance is going to come down as a corollary. I'm going to try and toggle up my calories. My ability to perform, my ability to cover might toggle up as well. But that is also context dependent, because if you're overweight or over fat, I'll use myself as the example because I can 100% attest to, when I'm over fat, kettlebell sport gets a lot harder because it's an endurance based sport, and being too heavy means that you don't have as good of muscular endurance, right? So there are certainly trade-offs, and there's an optimal point for everybody, for their body and for the task at hand, right? And so when I was an offensive lineman, my ideal playing weight was 280-ish pounds, which is what my football coach wanted me. The reason I did not do baseball in college, even though I was an excellent baseball player in high school, the reason I didn't do baseball in college was because the college baseball coach insisted that my playing weight be 240 pounds or less, because he wanted people that could run the bases. And so he said, you need to be under 240 pounds. So I had one coach telling me you need to lose 50 pounds, and I had another coach telling me you need to gain 30 pounds. And so I decided I did not want to have that level of fluctuation going from football season to baseball season, having to try and gain and lose 30, 40 pounds in the span of 3 months during college between football season and baseball season sounded like a terrible way to spend my holiday break. So instead I did track and field and rugby in the spring. So that I didn't have to do that, because to throw a shot put didn't require that I lose any weight. I could stay 270, 280 pounds and just throw heavy implements, right? So again, it depends on you. It depends on the task at hand, the optimal body weight for the performance of the task that you're trying to do. So keep that framework in mind as you're thinking about what are your goals and what are you trying to achieve. All right, hydration. I'll be quick on this. Hydration is really important, but generally it's, take your body weight, divide it by two, add 15 ounces per hour of activity. So, but again, hydration needs are going to vary from individuals. I do really love what the Texas Longhorns do. They just say use your pee as the use your pee as the guidance, because your body has this built-in hydration level feedback loop for you, right? And it's what color is your pee, right? So championship hydration level is anything that's, clear to light yellow, right? And then they equate being dehydrated, because there's such a degradation in performance when you're dehydrated. They equate being slightly dehydrated to just you're selfish, and if you're very dehydrated, you're basically an asshole, right? Or if you're peeing brown, you're a bad person, right? So I won't go that far to say that you're a bad person, but this is actually what the research is showing, is that hydration is so variant by person that even giving a prescription of like, oh, you need to drink 1 ounce per pound of body weight or per kilo of body weight, right? Even those types of prescriptions are maybe too general. So in general, I would say use your use your pee as just a good hydration feedback loop. But know that if you're dehydrated, that is going to have a significant effect on your performance. So make sure that you're staying hydrated and understand that if you train in a hot climate, that you need more electrolytes and you need more fluid. If you do multiple training sessions a day, like like Kim and Jake have a jujitsu gym as well as their day jobs, and so if you're like Jake and maybe rolling a jujitsu class in the morning that he's teaching, and then rolling a jujitsu class in the afternoon where he's a participant, like his hydration needs are going to be very different than somebody who is like me at a desk job for 9 hours a day, and then I'm going to go hit my gym in the garage for an hour, and it's 60 degrees in my gym, right? My hydration needs are going to be different than somebody who's doing 2 a days, right? So take your context into consideration. Use your pee as kind of the built-in feedback loop, and understand that when you're dehydrated, performance degrades, and you need not just water, you also need electrolytes, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Questions on hydration before because I'm glossing over this because I think most people get hydration pretty well. All right, cool. Silence. All right.
I just went and got some water while you were talking about it. So
calculating quality, and I'm happy to share out these slides for anybody after the fact, so you can have the resource if you're questioning how do you calculate your quantity, right? And this is where energy balance, super easy, right? It's just calories in, calories out. Everybody's heard that, except that it's a lot more complicated than that. Calories in is a function of your hormones plus appetite plus the food consumed plus your nutrient absorption minus your waste excretion, right? That's the calories in component, because one of the things that people don't really talk enough about is is that it's not necessarily just calories in, it's calories absorbed, nutrients absorbed. This is where gut health is really becoming more and more focused on, because if you have a parasite, for example, you can eat a ton of calories, but you're not absorbing them, and then you're still nutrient deficient. Or if you have a condition like celiac disease, like my wife and my son both have, they don't absorb nutrients as well because of the cilia of their small intestine being flattened by gluten, right? Those types of things are very, very important. Right. So calories out is also a function of your resting metabolic rate, the thermic effect of food, your non-exercise activity thermogenesis, and your exercise activity thermogenesis, right? So these things are multifaceted functions, which is why it's always a moving target, which is why I'm a huge fan of tracking, right? So if this sounds like, oh, this is a super easy equation, and then you're like, oh no, actually it's not, that is because it's not. It is the sum of millions and millions of metabolic functions, metabolic reactions happening in your body, or billions happening every second, right? So there's a lot going on here. So that's not to say that you can't manage it, right? But these are the factors that are important that you understand. Appetite is correlated to your hormones, your stress, sleep, illness, any medication, right? And then also psychosocial factors, right? Consumption can be based on your appetite, which correlates to stress. Some of us eat more when we're stressed. I also know people that don't eat when they're stressed. I don't understand those people, but I know they exist, right? There are people that are like, I'm so busy, I forgot to eat. Never happened to me, but everyone's a little bit different, right? Appetite can correlate to your stress. It can also correlate to your sleep, your hormonal response to different foods. So insulin, for example, insulin sensitivity decreases when you're sleep deprived. For example, your ability to process insulin decreases significantly when you're sleep deprived. You get more sleep, and even eating the exact same food suddenly has much less of an insulin response, right? So it's just important that you understand that there are a ton of factors, and the more things that you can stabilize, the better it's going to be. Think like a scientist. Remove as many confounding variables as possible. That is really, really crucial. So that's where routine is really, really helpful. That's where tracking is really, really helpful. That's why setting a sleep wake cycle is really important. If you're a high performance athlete, you're trying to be a high performance athlete, get your ass to bed on time. Get up at the same time every day, right? Figure out the foods that make you feel good and that make you perform well, and eat mostly those foods, right? Like really, there's a reason that the most disciplined athletes are usually also champions, or champions happen to be the most disciplined athletes, right? Because they tend to fall into these things and they really optimize for what makes them perform at their best. And that's where that consistency really comes into key, right? And so stabilize as many of these factors as possible, so that you get the best absorption possible. Does that make
You know,
sense?
I think an important point to make on this too is that, a lot of people, when they're jumping into changing their diet or trying to get healthier, they usually just go full on, just right in, and they change a lot of things at once. And I think it's important that to keep in mind that, small changes over time, when you're, changing one new thing each day to be healthier, also equate to, a big result at the end. And I think sometimes people get discouraged because they jump full in and they're like, okay, I'm going to track all my stuff from now on. I'm going to weigh everything. I'm only going to eat this many grams of protein. And if you're not used to doing it, it's a lot of work, right? And sometimes it can be very overwhelming jumping into it like that versus slowly tapering in these new things that are going to be your new day-to-day activities.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. And that it's really important to understand that if you, for example, just started your new kettlebell training block, that's probably not the time to also make a change in your diet, right? Because you already have one major change that just happened to your activity level, right? So don't also make a significant change to your diet. Keep your diet the same and see is how is that affecting you, right? Are you now losing weight because, and maybe that's what you wanted, or are you not performing as well as you want, or you're not recovering as well? Then you might need to make a change to your diet, right? But you don't know if you make those changes all at once, right? So unless you're working with a coach and your coach prescribes both a change in your programming and a change in your diet at the same time, right? That's going to be a different scenario. But if you're doing this on your own, I recommend removing as many or stabilizing as many variables as possible and only changing one at a time as much as you can. And just that's going to require patience, to Kim's point, right? Like, be patient. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Incremental change accumulated over time is incredibly powerful. All right, and then calories out, right? This is where we look at how do we calculate how much do we need? We need to understand what our resting metabolic rate is. How much does your body need just to sustain itself if you did nothing but sit and watch kettlebell videos all day, right? That depends on your size, your gender, your age, body fat percentage. That's your resting metabolic rate. Then we need to think about the thermic effect of food, which is your macros, micros, fiber, preparation, all of those things, right? And then the thermic effect of activity. These are the things. So these are the things that we can control. We can control the food. We can control the activity. We can't really control the metabolism, but the things that we can control are levers that can affect our resting metabolic rate, right? So we'll go into a little bit more detail on each of these pieces, right? So one example, the Mifflin-St. Jean equation, right? And there's a bunch of these out there. I actually have a spreadsheet that does an ensemble of three of the three most popular models for calculating RMR. So you've got an average across three different models to get you what a kind of a good estimate of what your resting metabolic rate might be for something like this, right? And so the factors that, again, change, the multipliers and things change based on if you're a man or a woman, what your height is, and we do it in metric because it's more consistent that way, right? And so this is my example, right? If I'm 118 kilos, you can see all of this, and what it comes out to for me is roughly 2,081 kilocalories a day. And I say roughly because there are margins for error on this, right? So, but that is essentially how many calories I would need per day if I did nothing but lay in bed, right? So, and this is again where those things like, well, and this obviously needs to change too because I'm not 36 anymore. So, but this is an old slide, but so it might even be a little bit lower. But like, if I'm trying to follow the recommended daily allowance is 2,000 calories a day, like that's not even enough for me to sustain myself if I just laid in bed all day, right? So this is where it's really important that you think about individual context and customization. Uh-oh, are we frozen? It looks like my thing froze here. So now I'll get back into it. All right. The thermic effect of food. You generally see protein is the most thermically active. It takes the most calories to digest, carbs in the middle, and then fat, very little. And this just starts to matter when you start thinking about calorie deficit versus not, right? So this is why when you're in a cut, you'll see protein generally gets more, and then carbs are kind of your next source, and then we try and minimize fat. So if you think about a bodybuilder, they're trying to optimize their body composition. You'll see them as they get closer and closer to their competition, they are mostly eating protein, a little bit of carbs, and a little bit of fat, but it's almost entirely like it's super heavy in the protein department. A lot of times you'll see them 60% protein and then 20% of their calories from carbs, and then only just minimal levels of fat, right? So you'll see people tweak these things, but that's because protein has the highest level of satiety and it has the highest thermic effect, right? So small thing, but it does matter over time, right? And then the thermic effect of activity, we have the non-exercise activity thermogenesis, aka NEAT. This does vary widely by individuals. Some people are fidgeters, some people are hand talkers, some people can't sit still. I'm one of those people. I fidget all the time. I'm almost always moving my hands, right? This does equate to roughly 6 to 10% of total energy expenditure, right?
Man, I must be burning so many calories then.
And it can for more highly active individuals, you can actually see that you can see that greatly increase. But have you ever noticed how you actually fidget less, like after you've just crushed yourself in a hard biathlon workout, for example, Kim? Like, what do you do when you get done with
Oh, for sure.
a heavy session?
Yeah, I think that we've talked about this before, but one of the things that I really like about kettlebell, because there's so many facets to it and there's so many things to think about while you're doing the movement, that it's just like if you were painting or something else that involves like a lot of mental activity. And so when you get done with kettlebell, usually I'm very like relaxed. I'm not thinking about a lot of things because my brain has just been, so vested in all these different things that were happening. So I would say yes, I probably do fidget a lot less like after I get done training. So
Yeah, and then even like we're not even aware of this a lot of times. They've actually tracked this in the lab, and it's super interesting. People that are in calorie deficits fidget less, they move less, they walk less. They're not motivated to get up from the couch as much, right? It's really interesting to see that just by putting somebody in a calorie deficit, our body is super smart. We just subconsciously move less, right? This is where having like a daily step goal is super important because especially if you're trying to reduce body composition or change body composition, reduce body fat stores, like saying, okay, I'm going to walk 10,000 steps every day, regardless of what my calorie deficit is. Like that's my baseline movement, right? Like that just sets you up for having stabilizing this variable a little bit more, right? Because you know that your training is going to be managed, but you if you're not doing anything to track how much you're moving, like you're not going to track how much you fidget, but you can have a step goal, right? That's a non-exercise activity goal that can help you stabilize this factor in your in your training, right? So then we talk about training. Here we go. Sorry, I'm getting frozen on my click throughs here. So multipliers based on lifestyle, right? Non-exercise activity, and this is just based on the type of work that you do. So as we're thinking about calculating how many calories do you need, we need to take into account, is your job highly active or is it desk bound, right? And there are some ranges here that will account for when we're estimating our calories, right? And then when we start moving forward, now we start talking about exercise activity thermogenesis, right? And there's a typo here, right? It shouldn't be neat, it should just be eat, right? This again varies widely in individuals, and it only accounts for moderate variability in expenditure. Because if you think about it, like, wait, but that's like the most active I am all day. Yeah, but even if you're a hardcore athlete and you're training 2 hours a day, or say you're Dennis Vasiliev and you're doing 2.5 hour sessions, but you're only doing that three or four times a week, that's still only 10 hours out of the week, right? The rest of it, all of your non-exercise activity, is a significantly larger portion of what your calorie needs are going to be. So supporting your training is actually a much lower calculation in the overall expenditure of calories. It's still really important, and it's the one that we're most cognizant of, but because it's intentional, it's mindful, it's what we care about, we know, and we want to go in there and crush it. We want to push ourselves, but it actually accounts for only a moderate variability in our energy expenditure. So we don't need to tweak our calorie intake nearly as much as a lot of people think that they need to. And one of the mistakes that I see especially new people make when they start working out is they're trying to lose weight, so they start working out and then they're not tracking enough, and then they actually end up eating a lot more, and because they're like, oh well, I crushed it today. I burned 900 calories doing long cycle. It's like, well, where did that number come from? Well, that was your wearable. And was that what was your baseline metabolism going to burn in that same 90 minutes that you worked out for? So you might have only actually burned like 200 extra calories than what you already would have burned, right? So it's really important that
You know,
we,
you just ruined everybody's day just now.
well, I'm not saying, I did also say we don't want to necessarily be in a deficit. So don't hear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that we don't want to adjust for our exercise, but what I want people to understand is like, one, you didn't earn a full large earn air quotes. You didn't earn a full large pizza because of your long session, right? You might need that just because of if you're under eating for your basal metabolic rate or your resting metabolic rate, right? You might need those extra calories, but just so we're clear, right? Like you're setting yourself up for failure a little bit if you are really trying to like eat the exact number of calories that you think that you burned, because there's error in those calculations of how much you actually burned, and there's error in all of these estimates, and those compounding margins can add up to making it challenging to move in the way that you want to move from a composition standpoint or even a performance standpoint if you're over indexing on any of those things. So just trying to give people the appropriate context to make the decisions that work best for them. There is no judgment here, but you don't have to earn your candy bar either, right? We're not dogs doing tricks for treats, right? If you want a freaking Snickers, eat a Snickers. I'll also I'll also put that out there. All right. But I will say one approach is minor caloric adjustments based on the duration and intensity of training. And this is an important factor for fueling for performance, right? If we're thinking about optimizing our performance, we do actually want to make some adjustments to our calorie intake based on the duration. It is more important the more high performance of an athlete you are. That's again like, so I'm picking on Jake a little bit, but he's very, very active because of what he does every day. So he's going to need a much higher adjustment based on the fact that he is doing multiple sessions a day as a jiu-jitsu coach, right? And so
I
here's
won't tell him that you've been talking about him on here.
yeah, and well, and as a high level athlete, make sure that you put that on so that he knows that I'm talking with respect. Right. So some exercise activity adjustments based on intensity of the day, right? So on a rest or recovery day, you might make no adjustments. And I will caveat this with saying this is for someone who is trying to either maintain or lose body weight, right? Um, if you're focused on really high performance and not concerned about your body weight, we might still want a calorie adjustment on your recovery day, right? But this was from the framework of somebody who's either trying to maintain or lose, right? So you might adjust by 10 to 15% of your resting metabolic rate on a light training day. A moderate training day might be 15 to 20, intense 20 to 25, and then competition day, I tell people 30 to 40%, because if you think about it from the context of our sport, right? The heaviest days that we have are our competition days, because for someone like me that's crazy and does triathlon, I don't do triathlon trainings for 10-minute competitive sets all within one day in my training cycle. That would be crazy volume, right? That's we don't want to do that very often. My volume builds to get me prepared for that, but then on competition day, that's the to go out and crush myself, right? So I might spike my volume by 30 or 40%. Well, also that's where you see 30 to 40% more calories, right? Because it's not because that's what my body needs from a calorie standpoint. That's going to help me recover from what I just did to my body. I've put my body through a really high level of stress. I've broken down a lot of tissue, and now I need calories to repair from that. I need to recover from that so I don't have huge hormonal spikes, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So these are just some adjustments you can make, and light, moderate, and intense is going to vary by the individual, right? And I will also say that this should be somewhat correlated to the duration of the session as well, not just the intensity. So don't make the mistake of thinking that an intense training day is, well, I did high intensity intervals for 9 minutes. I did, that can be a really hard workout. Don't get me wrong, right? But if the total time under tension was only a 10-minute session where you're sprinting for 10 seconds and then you're jogging for a minute and you do 10 rounds of that, that might only be 10 minutes of total training time. It can be super, super intense, but that would not qualify you for a 20 to 25% adjustment to your calories, right? So just I will caveat a little bit with that where this needs to be in the frame of how much total work did you do relative to what you normally do. Does that make sense as a clarification?
Yeah, for sure.
All right. And again, using myself as an example with my metabolic rate that we now know is a little bit low because I'm older than that. But if we adjust my calorie for baseline, right, I'm giving myself a 1.4 multiplier because I have a relatively sedentary desk job, right? So a very fairly low, fairly low. Is my screen blurry for anybody else? I'm seeing Dave Etchem is saying the screen is blurry. Is it clear for you, Kim? You're muted. Start. We'll try it again. So if I'm adjusting adjusting my calories for my training, I might only add 10 to 15% on a light training day. On a moderate day, I'm going to add a little bit more. On an intense day there, and on competition day, let's be honest, I don't track my calories. I eat whatever I want. I go to the party. I do what I want. I probably come in somewhere in this like twice as much as my normal amount of intake, and I'm totally fine with that, right? But that's comp day, and that's usually post competition. We'll get into the timing aspects here towards the end, but just as an example of how much does this actually equate to in terms of calories that you're seeing adjusted, right? These are some of the ranges. Kettlebell Drenga. Rating season is upon us. The battle for the North American champion returns to the Twin Cities for the 2024 WKSF North American Championship. Register today for your chance to fight for glory and claim your spoils. Registration is available for $100 with raffle prizes for all competitors and the opportunity to win cash prizes for the top performers. We'll be back at the Athlete Lab in Little Canada, Minnesota on Saturday, September 28th, accepting video submissions for online competitors. Go to TwinCitiesKettlebellClub.com to register today. Come, answer the call of battle. Join us. Fight for your clan. Fight for yourself. Claim your spoils and your glory. Sign up now, and may your name forever ring out in the Hall of Champions. Sign up today at TwinCitiesKettlebellClub.com. All right, so now I missed a slide again. So now we talk about type, right? Fuel type. So what are the types of fuel that we need? Macros, right? And if you're not familiar, protein, carbs, fat, and alcohol. I promised that I would talk about alcohol. I made a promise to Dave and Durka that we would talk about alcohol. So that is in here. I'm putting the cross through it because from the context of a macro, it is not something that your body can use for fuel. And since the framework of this conversation is performance, alcohol does not equate to high performance. That shouldn't surprise anyone. But it is technically a macro, but it's not one that our body can use for fuel. All right. So protein, building blocks of tissues, contains essential and non-essential amino acids. If you don't know what that means, you can Google it, but it's what your body needs to build new tissue, right? It's needed for muscle gain and repair of damaged tissues. Super, super important. Protein. There's a reason strength training athletes and athletes in general really need to focus on their protein intake as kind of their first macronutrient to really pay attention to. The recommended amount is 0.7 grams per pound of body weight for sedentary people. Athletes need more, right? And there was a question in the chat earlier about older athletes. Older athletes especially need more. So if you're over the age of 50, um, you can take this recommendation. You definitely want to err on the higher side because muscle loss as we age is a real thing, but it is mitigated most by continuing to strength train and continuing to eat a high protein diet, right? So those two things are two of the best things you can do as an aging athlete, to preserve your muscle tissue, right? So make sure that you're getting enough protein, and don't ever stop lifting heavy shit, right? That is really really important, right? So protein, really important. The ranges on this, there's a lot of mitigating research. I will say there there's more research coming out that's saying anything over 1 gram per pound of body weight might be overkill. And we also know that protein is generally, from a financial investment, is usually the most expensive macronutrient to pay for. So if budget is a concern for you, you can err on the lower side here, go with, zero point 0.8 or 1 gram per pound, right? But it's I would say erring on the side of caution from a what's going to have the best effect for performance. I would say do at least 1 gram per pound of body weight is probably going to be your best, your safest range. But again, it varies. It depends. I'm always going to say it depends, right? All right, carbs. I'm a big advocate for carbs. Carbs for performance, really, really important. All carbs break down into sugars, and it is the primary source of energy for intense activities like kettlebell sport. Kettlebell sport is a highly glycolytic sport. It taxes the upper end of the energy systems way more than the lower end. We tend to go over, at least into and around the anaerobic threshold, where we're in oxygen debt, fairly quickly. Some of us more quickly than others. Thank you. And some of us stay there longer. But what that means is your body is burning through glycogen and creating a lot of lactate, right? And in order to recover from that, you need carbohydrates. Okay. So if you don't have carbohydrates available, your body will use other things. It will primarily use it will start to break down, protein and convert it, right? But that's a metabolically expensive process. It creates other issues. It can create hormonal disruption, et cetera. And carbohydrates are a protein sparing nutrient. So if you're getting enough carbs, your need for protein actually goes down. If you're on a low carb diet, your need for protein goes up, right? So again, there's a lot here contextually, but it's important to know that we need carbs for fuel. It is the primary fuel of the brain. Everything breaks down into glycerides, and sugar and glucose in particular, is the primary fuel of the brain. It is what your brain uses to function, which is why when you go on a low carb diet, until you start converting into ketone bodies, you have brain fog. And a lot of people struggle ever getting to the point on a keto diet where they get enough ketones in their brain to where they don't have brain fog. So again, carbohydrates really, really important for performance, really important for performance in this sport. And again, this is where context matters. The type of sport that you're doing matters a lot for how many carbohydrates you might actually need to support it. That's why endurance runners, like people that do marathons, you'll hear a lot of them talk about how they went keto, and that was great for them. Well, they're ideally never going anaerobic threshold, right? They're never going over anaerobic threshold. They're staying in aerobic training zones, which is much more fat driven as a fuel. So a high fat diet makes sense as to why it would fuel their type of training really, really well. But for people that do combat sports, for people that do high intensity sports, football, rugby, hockey, kettlebell sport, et cetera, that we go super high intensity, those are going to have higher needs for carbohydrates to aid in recovery and to fuel performance. So general recommendation, big range here, right? 3 to 12 grams per kilo of body weight, depending on intensity and duration of exercise. And also, depending on your age, depending on your gender, women need more carbs. I will die on that hill. Women need more carbs than men do because of their cycle, because of their hormonal needs. They need more carbs than men do. There's a reason that a lot of women do not do well on low carb diets. Men can do a lot better on lower carbohydrate diets than women can. Women need more carbs, right? So I will, like I said, I will die on that hill. That is one of those things. And then as you age, that will change as well, right? But again, carbohydrates are protein sparing. So since we know as we age we need more protein, it also makes sense that you might need a little bit more carbohydrates as you age as well. And then last but not least, fat, not the demon macronutrient that it was made out to be in the late 80s and early 90s. Fat is essential. It is the coating that informs or that improves neurological function. So again, if we're thinking about performance, the more quickly your muscles can send signals to the working muscles, the better you're going to be able to perform. You need to have a myelin sheath on your nerves to be able to do that. The myelin sheath is made of lipids. So if you're doing too low of a fat intake, you're going to have problems with your myelination, right? And so we need fat. We also need it for creation of hormones. Most hormones are created from sterols, which come from cholesterol, right? So if you go too low fat, you can run into hormonal disruption, right? So this is again where the diet industry has done us a huge disservice because we've made people more insulin resistant, disrupted their hormone creation, et cetera, et cetera. And it's also the most satiety producing macronutrient. It's the reason pizza tastes good is fat. Like the combination of fat and carbohydrates is glorious, right? It sends off all kinds of happy chemicals in your brain, right? So it's important that we get it. Now, it also is the most calorically dense. So it's important that we don't over index on fat, which is why you see when bodybuilders are in their cuts, I'm going to use them again as an example. That's why they tweak their fats down as low as possible because it has 9 calories per gram, whereas carbohydrates and protein have 4 calories per gram. So when you're in a huge deficit and you only get, whatever, 1600 calories for the day, well, it's like, well, I could have 10 grams of fat or I can have 25 grams of carbs. They're gonna opt for the larger volume of food, right? So it's important that we think about these things and understand there's no maximum limit established for fat intake. So that's why you'll see people on ketogenic diets are eating sometimes 70 to 80% fat, but people that are on cuts are eating a much, much lower amount than that. So the range of fat that is necessary varies by individual a lot. What fuel source your body tends to use, the type of fuel that's necessary for the type of training that you do, how old you are, et cetera, et cetera. Your history of heart disease, cholesterol numbers, things like that are also important to understand. So there's a lot here with fat, but I would say the important thing is don't go too low. You never want to go below 20% of your daily calories from fat, because if you go below that, you start causing hormonal disruption that is going to mess up your metabolic function, which is also going to mess up your performance, right? So don't go too low, but there's also no maximum range. This is the one macro that you can kind of play with quite a bit, depending on individual preferences and kind of what you're doing. My approach to macros. So if I'm making a prescription for somebody, where do we start from, right? Well, we calculate the total daily energy expenditure, right? And I always start with protein. I went in the order that I calculate, right? Or well, in the order of importance. That's actually not true. I went in reverse. So I always start with protein. This is my highest priority, 1 gram per pound, right? So if I'm at 260, and you'll see people, this is another one where like 1 gram per pound of your current body mass or your target body mass. That depends on what your goal is, right? So if you're wanting to maintain, then you might want to go one gram per pound of current body mass. If you're trying to lose weight, you might want to go 1 gram per pound of your target body mass. And that's going to help you create that deficit that's going to make the change that you want. But you want to make sure that you have enough protein to support the lean tissue that you want, right? With the understanding, I will also make sure I say, if you're going 1 gram per pound of target body weight, that will mean that you will probably lose some lean tissue. Like even when you really over index on protein, if you're in a calorie deficit, you don't just lose fat, you lose fat and muscle, right? So Just be aware of that. So if you're really trying to preserve lean tissue, making sure that your protein intake is adequate is really important, right? And I already talked about it's 4 kilocalories per gram, right? So 260 grams times 4 kilocalories. 1,040 of my 2,900 roughly calories will come from protein. I will take that number out and then move on to fat because I want to make sure that I don't go below that 20%. I want to make sure that at the very least I'm at that 20% prescription so I can maintain my hormone health even while I'm trying to lose weight. Right? So we do that minimum 25%. Now I've got a disagreement. I said 20 on one slide and 25 on another. Sorry about that. But just don't go below 20. I'm using 25% here for the sake of easier math. So call that 725 kilocalories if we round down a little bit. Right? That gives me 9 calories per gram, gives me roughly 80 grams of fat to eat every day. Right. So now we've established 260 grams of protein, 80 grams of fat. And then what do? Is we just move on to, okay, what's the balance of calories that I have available to me for my carbs and or my dietary preferences. Right. So what I mean by that is if I can get 1,145 calories from carbs, and that would be 39%, but I don't really like eating carbs or I feel better on a higher fat diet, I know that I have 1,150 roughly calories to play with, and I could actually up my fat percentage if I wanted to and decrease my carb percentage. Or this is where we can start talking about carb cycling, right? And that's where we saw on that recommended daily intake, depending on the intensity of your exercise, you can start cycling these two macros, fat and carbs. Those can vary day to day depending on your training style, right? Depending on how you're feeling and also depending on preferences, right? So I actually have people track their calories and track their protein as a starting point. We don't always track every single thing, right? You can cycle and you can trade. We can horse trade across these. So you can really think of this as you basically have 1,900 calories of your 2,900 that I had to play with. I have roughly 1,900 to trade between my two preferred fuel sources, which are fat and carbs, right? And you can set the percentages at different places each day depending on what works for you, right? So there is some variability there and it gives you some flexibility, but it can also overwhelm people if you give them too many options, right? So I want you to understand how you can make these decisions for yourself. But the important thing is hit your calories and hit your protein need. And then the other things can fall into place. You can play with those things to see what makes you feel better, what makes you perform better, what are the needs that you have on a given day. All right. Some cheat sheets, right? What are the different sources? And again, this will be in the slides, which you guys can look at. And then because I said we would talk about it, alcohol, right? How do you track alcohol? Well, here's a quick cheat sheet, right? 1 ounce of whiskey, my drink of choice, right? Who only drinks 1 ounce? Come on, give me a double at least, right? So 2 ounces would be 140 calories. If I'm tracking that from my carbs, because that's where I have it, I would track that would be 36 grams if I'm doing a 2 ounce pour. If it's coming from fat, that would be 16 grams of fat, right? So, and again, you can do a blend. So some people take half of the calories from carbs and half of the calories from fat, but you need to account for alcohol is the point, right? If you're going to consume it, you need to track it because otherwise you can really get into the hurt locker where it's like, oh, well, I swear I hit my 2,900 calorie goal. It's like, oh yeah, did you count the 4 bourbons that you had? Oh, no, I didn't count those cocktails. Crap, how many calories are in that? Well, if it was 4 double ounce pours, right? You start talking 140 calories per drink. Oh shit, where'd your deficit go? Well, it went into your booze, or now you're no longer in a deficit. Now you're not even at maintenance. Now you're in a surplus. Oh, and then you had pizza because you had 4 cocktails at the end of the night, right? So this is where it's important that we track these things. This is where data is
Are
your
you going to load these spreadsheets into the files in the group?
Yep, I'll share this. I'll share the slides in the group so everybody has these resources, and then I have some other resources. So like the tool I talked about where you can calculate your BMR. It's an ensemble of the models. I'll give you guys access to that sheet as well. So I'll give you guys some resources that you can use for this kind of stuff. Okay, questions on booze? Anybody want to share a cocktail recipe with me? No. All right.
I don't know, but I just had a Moscow Mule the other night and we put tahini with it. It was solid.
Nice. Nice. So again, alcohol is poison. Poison is not good for performance. Okay. So it slows your metabolism, blunts protein synthesis, inhibits restorative sleep, decreases testosterone, increases estrogen. It's a known carcinogen, etc. Oh, and if you drink, don't drive, call a sober ride. PSA, right? Cover our butts. But just putting that out there in the context that everybody knows that I like alcohol, right? I drink on occasion, right? But these are the things that it does from a performance standpoint. So if you're really serious about performing at a high level, alcohol's not your friend, right? So just putting that out there. All right, quality. Micronutrients. We talked about macros. What are micros? The vitamins and minerals that we ingest serve as cofactors for critical metabolic functions, right? They're in the highest concentration in our seasonal produce. I used to say seasonal fresh produce, but it's actually just seasonal produce because frozen is totally fine, right? If it's picked at the peak of its freshness, that's when it's going to have the highest macronutrient or micronutrient content. So like using frozen berries in the wintertime when it's not berry season is probably a better choice from a micronutrient density perspective than buying the shitty fresh berries that are being grown in California during the winter months, right? They've actually analyzed this and there's actually a higher concentration of micronutrients in frozen. So don't let anybody tell you that it has to be fresh, right? Is kind of my point. And organic versus conventional, that's a budgetary decision. Are there benefits to organic? Probably. But again, think about what's the trade-off in cost versus benefit for you. So the most important thing is that you're getting these things in. Don't focus on the little things before you focus on the big things. If you're already getting all of these things and you're like, oh, I'm thinking about switching to organic because I think it might be better for me. Cool. If you can afford it, do it. But don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Right. You don't have to buy all organic, locally sourced, raised by monks and, massaged and like just get what you can afford, get the highest quality stuff that you can afford. And eating sufficient calories of a well-balanced diet of mostly whole foods and minimizing processed foods is the best way to get these micros into your body. All right. So what are they? Fat soluble vitamins, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin E, vitamin K. These things are all very, very important. They're called fat soluble because they require fat present in the diet in order for your body to absorb them. Again, don't go too low on fats because your body can't absorb fat soluble vitamins if you don't have enough fat. So make sure you get your fat soluble vitamins. It is also important to know that the difference between fat soluble and water soluble is that if you overeat or over ingest a water soluble vitamin, your body just pisses it out. If you over ingest a fat soluble vitamin, your body stores it in the fat cells. So this is where you can run into toxicity if you over consume. And this is usually more of a problem from supplementation. People will over consume a particular supplement because, somebody's chiropractor told them that they should, take 100,000 IUs of vitamin D or something. And they take that as gospel and then they without getting their labs done and they overeat, right? Or they over ingest a fat soluble vitamin. So just know fat soluble vitamins are not as easy for your body to excrete. It's usually very easy for your body to be tested for these types of deficiencies. So testing for vitamin and mineral deficiencies is a good idea, especially if you're having any type of performance issues or health issues. Like ruling out vitamin deficiencies and mineral deficiencies is a super easy, low cost way to help improve your health. It can also be worth it if you're trying to maximize performance. Just getting a quick, vitamin and mineral screen, like a vitamin D test is like $10. And vitamin D is one of the cheapest supplements on the planet. Right. So just knowing what your vitamin D levels are and getting your vitamin D to its appropriate levels can be one of the best things you can do to improve your performance and your overall health. All right, so that's our fat soluble. Water solubles are mostly the B vitamins and vitamin C. Right. I'm giving you all of the names here that you might see on
Are you able to silence everyone else?
yeah, I did.
Somebody's on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, I did. I'm giving you these names because you might not see it on the label of a supplement. If you're taking a supplement, you might see it labeled as vitamin B1 or you might see it labeled as thiamine, right? So it's important to be able to reference those things so you know what you're getting. All right, and then the minerals, the macro minerals. Not to be confused with macronutrients, but it's similar because these are the ones that we need in the highest concentrations: sodium, calcium, magnesium, potassium, also known as the electrolytes. The electrolytes keep the balance of our electricity in our body. That's really important for heart rhythms, right? So that's where you can run into problems if you see people get deficient or too high in any of these things. One thing that we're finding more and more research on is a lot of us are deficient in sodium. Sodium is really, really important for contractile capability of the heart, right? You'll also see people sometimes get under indexed in magnesium, right? So getting your electrolytes in is really important. I really like the Element salt packs. I take those. I take one of those every day just as a baseline, and then if I'm training that day, I also take another one after my training. Again, I'm a big guy, so two of those a day is going to be fine for me. Some people might not need two of those a day. It's going to depend on you, but generally, people usually need more of these macro minerals than they're probably getting. And then there's a whole bunch of trace minerals. These are the ones that we need in much smaller amounts: boron, selenium, chromium, iron, copper, zinc, etc. But these things are all really, really important. These minerals tend to help with enzymatic functions, and it's really important that you get these in the way that you need. And this is why one of the problems that we have when we're in a deficit for too long is that you will see people come up with mineral deficiencies because they're just not eating enough food, or they're not eating a diversified enough diet to get all of their macro minerals and trace minerals into their body, and that starts to have function issues, cascading dysfunction throughout the metabolism if you're missing those things.
Chris Denning had a question. He said, for K2, are you taking both MK4 and MK7?
Um, it's going to depend on the supplement. If you're taking it supplementally, it's going to depend on the supplement. I tend to just take a vitamin D plus K2 supplement, but I don't think I think that's a it depends, and it's a very detailed question. That's a more of an individual thing. I just take a vitamin D plus K2. Good question. All right, nutrient timing. This is one that people ask a lot about. So how do you time your nutrition around a workout? And this, for kettlebell sport people, I think we need to recognize that there is a wide array of what level of tolerance you have on having things in your stomach during a particularly long cycle and jerk when you're dropping things on your belly. So if I say you should eat 2 to 3 hours before training, and you're like, I can't have anything in my stomach, so I don't eat 5 hours prior to training, that's you do you. Don't take my recommendation as gospel over what makes you feel good. But this is as far as like what is typically good for most people, right? Getting a nutrient dense meal a few hours before, with sufficient protein, with some carbohydrates and a little bit of fat is usually a good idea for a pre-workout meal. if you've ever if you've ever tried to work out having just eaten a really fatty meal like 2 or 3 hours before, you know that cannot end well. Sometimes it can cause a lot of gastric distress. Nobody wants to poop their pants on the platform, so just be careful with how much with how much fat you eat prior to a training. And then the post training window, you'll hear, the bro science of like, you got to get it in within 30 minutes, right? I just say get it in as quickly as you can within reason, right? If you don't feel well enough to consume anything, like if I really push myself on a long cycle session, I might not feel like putting anything into my stomach for like 30 minutes, and that's okay, right? Like I'm not missing my anabolic window because I didn't drink my protein shake within 30 minutes of training, right? Like I wait until my stomach can handle it. But you want to get, and I generally keep it to some type of liquid for post workout, because your body can get it in quickly. It minimizes distress of the gastric intestinal tract, and you'll be able to see the most rapid effect. If you've ever had the shakes after like a snatch session where your hands are shaking, that's usually because you've worked through all of your available glycogen. So the sugar energy that your body stores and fuels for training with. If you've depleted most of that and you start getting the shakes, and then you drink a high carbohydrate drink, the shakes go away pretty quickly thereafter, which is pretty incredible, right? But that's because your body is now getting the signal that it's getting the nutrients it needs, and it's going to take those carbs and replenish your glycogen stores first and foremost. That's the first thing it's going to do with them. That's why carbohydrate energy immediately following a training session is actually a good time to have carbohydrates, right? So we want that because it's going to stimulate our protein synthesis. It's going to stimulate our parasympathetic system, which starts slowing us down. So parasympathetic being like parachute, right? It slows things down. You've just cranked everything up to 11, especially if you're training like Kim or you're doing one of Kim's workouts. You've been kicked in the ass. We now need to start the stress decrease and allow our body to heal and recover. That's why this post, forget the anabolic window, really getting your body into that rest, digest and recover phase as quickly as possible is what's going to enable high level performance, right? The faster you can get into recovery mode from the stress that you've done, the faster your body will be prepared to do it again, and the higher level you'll be able to perform at the next time, right? So this is where that post-training nutrition starts coming in, when we start thinking about how do we use it to take our training to the next level, where these little things can make a difference, right? And then post training, that's just any nutrient dense meal. And I just say make sure that you're getting protein at every sitting, right? Get your remaining macros from your carbohydrates and get your remaining macros from your fat. And this is assuming that you're training at the end of the day or towards the end of your day. That's most people. But again, this can be tweaked depending on when you're working out, right? If you're somebody that works out in the morning, a common question I get is, well, is it okay to work out on an empty stomach first thing in the morning? Yes. Yes, it is. If that's when you can consistently get your training in, right? Just understand that you need to have fuel. Excuse me. That you need to have fuel for that training session that needs to be consumed probably the day prior, especially if you don't want to wake up early enough to eat 2 to 3 hours before you work out. Make sure that you have enough fuel the night before, right? You don't have to work out on a full stomach. There are all sorts of benefits to working out on an empty stomach as well. And that's there is no one right answer. Sorry about that. All right. Competition nutrient timing, slightly different, obviously, than training days. Competition is a different deal. I tell people, make sure that we are not doing much fat before competition, and we want to load carbohydrates 1 to 3 days prior to the competition. And the reason for that is that it takes time for your body to break down the carbohydrates into the glycogen and then shuttle that glycogen into your liver and into your working muscles. Those are the two places that glycogen is stored, right? That doesn't happen overnight, right? So people that are crushing a donut before they go get on the platform and thinking that that's going to fuel them on the platform, all that's going to give them is a little bit in their bloodstream. You're going to get a little bit of a blood sugar spike from that, but all of the rest of that fuel for that session is already in your working muscles. And if it ain't there, your body can't get it there in time. And there's no amount of gummy bears that you can crush that can fill that gap, right? So this is where the marathon runners had it right, that they carb load a couple of days ahead of time, right? Because your body needs time to break it down and move it to the working muscles, right? If you're consistently eating enough carbohydrates, you really shouldn't have a problem with this. But again, we're talking about how do we optimize performance. Just make sure you have enough carbohydrates in your system, and maybe over index on carbohydrates a couple of days before a high performance, a high performance event like a kettlebell sport competition. I don't generally recommend consuming any protein during a session or during a competition. And again, carbohydrates throughout, and this is going to depend on your gastric tolerance for having things in your stomach. This is why a lot of people eat gummy bears, because they're very small. They get a high level of carbohydrate energy into the system, but it's going to be relatively small in the stomach, not create a big fundus of food that's going to be sitting in your tummy, right? And no fat. We want things to be absorbed as quickly as possible. Fat takes a long time to digest. It can again cause gastric problems. No poopy platform sets, please. And then after Yeah, I saw you smart, Kim. uh, and then after, get your
Someone
protein.
might never remember your set, but if you poop on the platform, you will live in infamy, like
Exactly. Exactly. So immediately following, you know, again, and I said within 30 minutes, but again, that varies on the person, right? So if you're not feeling ready to eat 30 minutes after, don't force yourself to eat when you're not feeling it. But as soon as you're feeling up to it, start getting these things in, and you want protein and carbohydrates, and generally in a 1 to 2 ratio. Again, you want high level of carbohydrates, because I'm assuming on competition day you went out and left it all on the platform. You're giving it everything you have. Now is the time to really start stimulating recovery immediately following that effort. If you want fat, if you want some fat in your diet, or in your after session, totally fine. Go for it, right? So long as you don't have to get back on there to do a jerk set or a team relay or something like that, right? Make sure that you're totally done with your sets before you start ingesting a bunch of fat. But that's generally competition day training, nutrient timing for people. Supplementation, legal disclaimer number 2. I'm putting this in here again. I'm not a doctor. Check with your doctors before adding any supplements. In case you weren't aware, the FDA does not regulate supplements. Okay, they don't inspect supplement companies. They can claim whatever they want. They don't test their ingredients. It's the fucking Wild West when it comes to supplements in the United States, at least. So just make sure that you check and buy from reputable brands with safe manufacturing practices. And I recommend ones that have third party quality testing, so that you know that what they say is in their supplement is what's in their supplement, and you're not trusting them to test their own products. They're hiring a third party company to do it. A few brands that I recommend: Douglas Labs, Nutridyne, Driven Nutrition, Revive, Legion. They're ones that I've personally used. Not a paid endorsement, not giving you an affiliate code or an affiliate link or any of that shit. Like, these are just ones that I have personally used. Feel free to check your other ones if they have the NSF certification. If they do third party quality testing, they're probably going to be okay. And I will say that those ones, and this is not to say that it's always a corollary, that cost is not always a corollary to quality, but if they have those things, it costs money to do this type of testing. So typically they're going to be more expensive supplements. If you're buying the cheapest supplements you can get at Walmart, you're playing Russian roulette a little bit, right? Just saying. So sometimes you get what you pay for. Just do your diligence. All right. With that said, I break supplements into 3 categories: essential, recommended, and then optional, basically. And that's usually a function of ones that are the essentials are ones that we know are safe, they've been well researched, and they're generally cheap, right? I don't make these recommendations because I want people to spend a bunch of money on supplements. If you're hitting all of your needs with your diet, great. Then supplementation is not super important for you. And diet is always the higher priority. But essential supplements, protein, because most people have a hard time hitting the protein recommendations that I talked about earlier without some supplemental protein. Like 260 grams of protein a day is a lot for me, even for me. And I love meat, right? But I also take a protein supplement, right? Omega 3s, good for heart health, good for all sorts of things. Again, that myelination of the brain and myelination of the nerves. Omega 3 fatty acids, really, really important. Those of us that live in the Western world, we're over indexed on omega 6s and we're under indexed on omega 3s because we don't eat enough fish and seafood. So taking a supplemental omega 3 is really good for your brain, really good for your heart, and really good for performance. Vitamin C, water soluble, cheap, helps with a lot of things, particularly immune function. Vitamin D functions more as a hormone. It's the only hormone that your body, or the only vitamin that your body produces on its own. So that tells you how important it is. We spend so much time indoors now that almost everyone, like something like 80 to 90% of people in the Western world, are vitamin D deficient. Super cheap to get your vitamin D levels checked. Super cheap supplement. One of the best things you can do: take vitamin D every day. 5,000 IUs is usually a safe recommendation, but again, get your levels checked and customize your intake based on that. Magnesium, super important for sleep, and other functions, but again, one of those electrolytes. So these are generally the ones, and then zinc is another one. These are generally the ones that I recommend for everyone, just because they are safe, effective, and cheap. That's why I call them essential. Again, not to say that you have to buy them, but they're very, very beneficial and they don't do any harm. Oh, and then last but not least, creatine monohydrate. I don't usually include this on the essentials. This is usually on the recommended. But since I'm talking to athletes and since we're talking about optimizing performance, creatine monohydrate is the safest, most effective, most well researched, and cheapest sports performance enhancing supplement that there is. 5 to 10% increase in muscle contractile ability. It forces water inside the working cells. You will see a little bit of increase in water retention when you first start taking it. Dosage is 5 grams a day. You can hyperload to get to the saturation point faster. It's not required. So long as you're taking 5 grams a day, once you reach saturation, you'll start seeing performance improvement because of creatine monohydrate. It is really, really well researched. That is one that I recommend for everybody who considers themselves an athlete. And it's cheap. You don't need to buy like any of these buffered creatines or like that's all marketing bullshit. Just get a cheap creatine monohydrate from a reputable company and take it every day and you'll be good. And there's also a lot of benefits that they're finding for brain function. They're starting to research it for reduction in Alzheimer's and ALS and other types of neurological diseases. So creatine is a good one. Recommended supplements. Branch cyclic dextrin is really just a carbohydrate supplement that's easy to digest. It's the one that I recommend for most of my athletes for post training. Again, getting those carbohydrates in quickly to get you in that rest and digest and recover mode. This one really helps since you're trying to get liquid carbs in. Now, again, you don't have to get it from a supplement. You can drink orange juice. You can drink chocolate milk. I don't want orange juice in my stomach immediately following a training set. I don't know about y'all. I don't want chocolate milk in there. I'm usually doing something with water and something fairly easy to digest. So branch cyclic dextrin, creatine monohydrate, again, as I talked about on the essentials, so I won't belabor it here. A micro supplement like a greens supplement. You'll also find micro mineral supplements you can get in pill form. CBD/THC. CBD very anti-inflammatory. THC and I'm talking microdose of THC, just helps the broad spectrum cannabinoids, so that you get the effect that you're looking for. Can really help with inflammation, recovery, and sleep. And that is it for my recommended. And then optional, beta alanine. There's debate, but it's supposed to help you buffer lactic acid, the effect of lactate in the muscles. So that there's debate as to whether or not that actually is real. So, the scientists are arguing amongst each other whether or not that's an actual beneficial supplement. So, some people say yes, some people say no. L-glutamine, this is present in protein. It's the most common amino acid, but it's also really highly concentrated in your digestive tract. So if you're having digestive issues, L-glutamine can be something that can help with leaky gut. That's a different protocol, but it's one that's recommended by a lot of people. I'm less a fan unless you're having a leaky gut, but I have a different protocol for that. EPO helps with oxygen into the muscles. Trenbolone, okay, those last two were jokes. Those are PEDs that will make you pop on a WADA test. So do not take exogenous hormones or EPO, please. That was a joke. I was just seeing if people are paying attention. All right. And last, I know this has been a lot. Last but not least, I will get into a little bit on periodization. I will go relatively quickly here because I want to be respectful of people's time. But I very much recommend working in a seasonal format. We are athletes and we should act as such. So preseason, in season, postseason, and off season, making sure that we are taking things into account. Know that our competition season, has a physiological impact. Intensity has a cost, and that cost requires that we work on recovery, right? So it's okay to understand that we're going to burn through some of our available stores, and this is going to have a cost, but we can't be in season all the time. So we need to make sure that we take time for recovery from the grind, right? Before we transition into the off season. We need to recover first, because when we transition into the off season, that's when it's time for us to start working on either addressing our deficiencies or building on our strengths. And we're starting to put some cost back into our training, right? In the intensity of the season, we recover from, then we start building back up to work on our strengths or weaknesses. And then after our off season is done, then we start transitioning back to getting ready for peaking in our season. So we start transitioning back into our uh, sport specific training modes, right? So this is kind of how I think about it, and then aligning how those things look. So this is again my own personal periodization as an example, right? So we're right here towards the end of December, and in the off season starting in January, I am going to be focusing here on my conditioning endurance in the off season. That's really the first focus. And for me, because I'm too heavy, I'm going to do an 8-week cut, right? A planned 8-week cut. And then I'm going to do a slight recovery phase after that because, again, calorie deficit creates stress. And so I need to recover from that. So I'm going to go from doing my cut, transition to a recovery mode, and then I'm going to focus on maintenance. So just trying to keep the weight loss that I hopefully achieve in that 8-week cut, maintaining that for 8 weeks before I do another cut. I don't want to do a really long cut because that's going to, again, create deeper and deeper stress, more and more metabolic disruption. So I'm going to cut, recover, maintain, cut again, right? And then I will do probably a slight recovery before I move back into, and recovery usually means a surplus for me, like a slight surplus, not the same way as like a building phase if I'm trying to build muscle, right? I put that for December just because it's the holidays and I know I'm going to eat like an asshole during the holidays. So I put that as a build up phase and I'm training heavier. But build up phase is when we're in a caloric surplus. Recovery is a slight caloric surplus. Maintenance is where we're trying to balance input and output so that we can get higher levels of performance. I don't go into a build up phase in season because I'm not trying to gain weight. I'm just trying to maintain, but this calorie number might be higher in the in season phase, right? But that's where you can see I go into my peaks. This is the riddle. Oops, sorry. This is the riddle struck open, right? This first star is the riddle struck open, which I think is July 27th is what I had heard, or towards the end of July up in Canada. So I'm going to go up for that. And then this second star is my competition here in the Twin Cities, right, for the WKSF North American Championship. And then I might put something here in November or December, but I'm building my entire year around when do I want to peak, and I'm planning my training phases around that and aligning my nutrition phases to make sure that they support the goals of each phase, right? And so this is what I'm talking about when we're talking about periodization and making sure that you align your periodization of your nutrition with the periodization of your training. That's what I call my integrated training periodization, right? So this is really, really important, and that's what I really focus on as a coach is making sure that I think about all of those things. All right. So in closing, 10 tips for you guys. Like Kim alluded to, start with the easy things. Start with your lowest hanging fruit. Start with the basics. Are you getting enough sleep? Are you drinking enough water? Are you training consistently? Are you eating high quality foods? Right? Start with the fundamentals first. Don't worry about your supplementation and your nutrient timing and all of that shit until you've got your basics handled. Focus on addition before subtraction. Number one takeaway from this was you cannot perform at your optimal in a deficit. So if you're trying to take things away, you're probably not supporting your optimal performance. So focus first on adding things. Add more water, add more vegetables, add more fruit, right? Add more calories, add more protein, whatever it is, wherever those areas are, focus first on what you need to add, and you'll have positive displacement of negative things, right? If you're drinking more water, you probably won't drink as much soda just because our stomach has limited volume, right? So just focus on positive displacement, focus on addition before subtraction. This one is more for me. Make it tasty. I've talked a lot about food as fuel here, and everything's talking about fueling performance. But let's acknowledge the fact that food is delicious, and it's not just fuel. Unless you're somebody like Steve Riddle who can think of it that way and really just focuses on fueling his body, that's fantastic. If you're wired that way, I'm not. So I say make sure that you actually enjoy your food, right? Make it tasty. Don't sacrifice flavor for the sake of, oh, my macros are going to be perfect, because adherence, longitudinal adherence, is going to be the key to success. So if it doesn't taste good, you're not going to stick with it for very long. So make sure you like it. Be a scientist. Track, measure, and iterate. Minimize confounding variables. Talked about that a lot. So be a scientist. Make it work for you. Everyone is different. Customize, customize, customize. That's where number 4 really, really helps. Knowing what the data is telling you on how to customize it for you. And don't let anybody tell you what works best for you if you know that it's not working for you. Like, well, you really should be eating this. Like I actually had somebody coming to me who was having severe gastric issues and kept eating chickpeas because he was told by a dietitian that chickpeas were the healthiest source for him. We got him a food sensitivity test and he was fucking allergic to chickpeas. So he was giving himself diarrhea and he kept eating it because somebody told him that it was good for him. Somebody that had the credential, but he knew it wasn't, he knew his stomach wasn't doing well, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Right. So make it work for you. Kim, what you came off mute. What do you got to say?
Oh, I was just waiting. I just felt like there was going to be a point where I would like want to say something.
Number 6, let go of perfection. Progress over perfection. Incremental progress accumulated over time is what leads to change. Let go of the notion of perfection. You're not going to be perfect. Number 7, you've heard me say it a few times. Know that intensity has a cost, and that's not just in training. That is also in your nutrition, right? If you're on a cut, that's hard work. Don't let anybody lie to you and tell you that it's easy to lose weight, right? Like for some people, it might be easy, but in general, like if you're doing it the right way, it requires focus, it requires tracking, it requires discipline, and it has a cost, both social, emotional, and physical, right? So like know that and know that you can't be in a cut all the time, right? So know that anything that is high intensity has a cost to it and plan for that, right? Periodize your nutrition, tying to that. Make sure that you're going through those phases. Periodize your training, right? Align those plans. Those things are what I think are really the fundamentals. And so a bonus one, this is optional, but I'm going to give it a plug, right? Work with a coach. And I'm not saying me, right? This isn't a plug for me, but I'm saying work with a fucking coach. If you have questions on these things, have a coach, right? And not everybody's going to be able to do all of these things. You might need multiple coaches. Like Kim's talking about, she has her coach Arseni who does her programming. She was working with a dietitian when she decided she needed to cut, right? It's okay to have more than one coaches with domains and areas of focus too, right? Like I'm really weird. I'm one of the few people that like nerds out really, really hard on nutrition, and I do both of these things, but like work with a coach, because especially if you're looking to go to the highest level of your capability, having a team of coaches or multiple people help you do this is a lot to focus on yourself, and it's a lot to manage. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of thought, right? So if you need a
And
coach,
it gives you somebody to keep you in check, when when you're working with your kettlebell coach, like they're giving you a set workout. Well, if I'm just like kind of coming into the gym, going to do whatever that day, I'm less likely to one, pick the harder thing to do. And I'm less likely to potentially follow through with the training because I'm not turning it into anybody. It's just on me. And some people, or a lot of people, need that person to turn their homework into, to be like, yeah, I got it all done. And it's the same way. It was so much easier for me to cut when I had that nutrition coach, because every week I had to check in with her. I had to send her my numbers. She'd send me a new data point to be like, hey, this week we're going to adjust carbohydrates and we're going to adjust it at these times during the day. And it made it a lot easier to stay on track for those 6 months where I was being very strict about what I was allowed to eat, when I could eat it, and if I was doing it on my own, I probably wouldn't have stuck with it. Plus, you're paying for it. So you're like, I gotta do it. I just spent money on this. And so there's some amount of investment, when you have put something into it.
yeah, we all hate the pain of throwing away money, right? Like nobody wants to pull out a $20 bill and light it on fire, yet alone several $100s, right? So if you're working with a coach, you're going to be a lot more likely to follow through. And that's not to say that you need a coach all the time, right? Like Kim had it for a period of time where she needed the nutrition support because she was doing a cut. When you're in maintenance and you've kind of figured out how to stay at your body weight, right? Like you don't need a coach, right? Like when I'm trying to stay at 260 pounds, I don't work with a coach because I know how to do that. I've done it for over a decade. But when I decide I want to go from 260 to 240, I'm probably going to hire a coach, even though I could do it myself. But like to Kim's point, I don't have anybody to turn in my homework to then. Then it's just me being I have to be 100% honest and transparent with myself, which I'm not great at. I don't know anybody that is like perfect at that, right? We're all capable of lying to ourselves or cutting ourselves some slack and things like that. And coaches generally don't do that nearly as much unless you need it. Hopefully you've got a good coach that will be like, "Hey, it's okay," especially if you're predisposed to beating yourself up, right? But like again, that's where having a coach, I think, is super beneficial. So, but these 10 tips I think are really important. And the bonus one is just if this seems like a lot, it's because it is, and that's a reason this is a profession that people have chosen. So, if you can afford it, work with one. If you can't, I will help you as much as possible for free with with the understanding that I have limited time and capability. But I will give you free resources. I will point you to resources. I will point you to quality information. Right. So that is it. Um,
Well,
I,
it wasn't as boring as I thought it was going to be. You said slides, and I immediately was like, somebody shoot me.
well, thank you. It just helps me stay more structured. Otherwise, it's very tangential, and this would have been a 2.5 hour talk rather than 90 minutes. So, if people have questions, they can put them in the chat. But as you probably heard, it depends is going to be the start of the answer to almost anything anybody can ask. Somebody did put in the chat, if you're taking vitamin D, make sure you're getting enough magnesium. That is true, and also vitamin B. But yeah, if you're going to take supplemental D, you do want to make sure you're not deficient in magnesium. Those things are synergistic. So
Okay, well, I really appreciate it. Our next live is going to be with Steve Cotter, and he's going to be talking about the history of kettlebell sport. So that should be pretty interesting. And then we have a couple other ones coming up. We've got one on juggling. So if you're interested in breaking toes or getting hit in the face, that is definitely one you should tune in for. I actually do enjoy juggling. I'm not that great at it, but it is kind of fun. And then we'll have some other
there's a
ones
question in
lined
the
up.
chat I want to there's a question in the chat I want to answer. Sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
So C just asked, I mentioned the benefits of fasted training, and I'll try and be brief. The benefits of fasted training, we're thinking about metabolic flexibility. So there are two primary fuel sources that your body uses: carbohydrates and fat. And if you train in the absence of calories in the body, your body has to be able to use both of those fuel sources to be able to manage them. So training while fasted is something that forces your body to be able to use both carbohydrates and fat, and it's something that there are metabolic flexibility protocols that people do. So that can be pairing your diet. So like doing periods of keto, like I don't recommend that anybody does keto all the time, because if you're only reliant on high fat as a fuel source, then you can't metabolize sugar very well. And if you're only eating really high levels of carbohydrates, you're not going to be able to use fat as a fuel source very well either. So metabolic flexibility is really what the benefits of training, sometimes training fasted, sometimes training fueled, sometimes eating low carb, sometimes eating high carb, right? All of those things, like again, periodization and variability is what's going to lead to a more adaptable and flexible body. So that's kind of the brief answer of, and that's a whole topic that you can go find hour-long podcasts about, building metabolic flexibility, training while fasted, what are the benefits, et cetera, et cetera. But that was what I was alluding to.
If anybody has other questions, feel free to either comment on the group page, or you can also comment in here, and we'll try and get to those questions. And then Jordan's going to upload the presentation underneath the Files tab, so you can go back and pull those up, as well as his, what do you want to call it, your caloric
Yeah,
spreadsheet.
it's a macro calculator, right? Basically.
So, but yeah, I agree. Like, there's tons of resources out there as far as coaches go. When I did it, I went through Renaissance periodization. So, I mean, I'm not recommending them one way or another, but you can work directly with a dietitian. I think they also have like an online
They have an
option where you're not directly, yeah, an app where you're not working directly with somebody. But it basically just goes through and lines out when you're supposed to eat, how much you're supposed to eat, and just gives you the basics of proteins and carbohydrates that you eat for each meal and not necessarily what you are supposed to eat for that meal. Because, you know, you should have some variance and, like you said, enjoy what you're eating so that it's not a chore. And so that was one thing I always liked is I could just be like, okay, well, you know, I decided to have this piece of chocolate cake. So that kind of means that for the rest of the day, I'm limited on what I get to have with keeping it within my macro levels.
Yeah.
So,
Gives
because I definitely
you the
still,
guardrails.
yeah, when I was cutting weight, I was still had, you know, some of the things that I liked. It just meant that I had to cut it out from other areas. Maybe I didn't get the fat for that day or whatever, to try and keep it in that macro level. So, but I really enjoyed the talk. I really appreciate you doing this. You know, a lot of people come on here, and all the people that come on and present, they are all just donating their time and they're not getting paid. So, I appreciate everybody that comes on and does presentations for the Kettlebell Almanac. So,
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. And for anybody, if you have any follow-up questions or want to reach out specifically to me for any questions, Twin Cities Kettlebell Club at gmail.com is my email. So feel free to email me. Like I said, I'm happy to help people as much as my time allows.